Okay, good evening, everyone. We're just working on getting our other panelist in, but hopefully he'll be in shortly. So welcome to our open house for the survey results and initial release of the draft community vision and broad goals. So I'm just going to start with a very short update, and then I will hand it over to our survey administrator, Local Decisions. Great. So just a reminder for WebEx, our program here, when we get to the end with open questions to the public, we will be paying attention to who has raised their hand first and asking you to speak in turn. If you're on your computer, which I believe most of you are, the bottom right-hand side says participants, and if you click on that, then hover by your name, there's an option to raise your hand. It looks like a little hand there. Whereas if you're on a phone, you can use *3 to do the same thing, and we'll be able to see your hand raised. Once you're done speaking, just a reminder to put that back down so we don't call on you again. So we're here because we're doing the Electoral Area E official community plan review and update. We've been in several meetings, and there are more background materials online that I'll point you to. Just to keep you up to date on where we are in the project, this is the end of phase 2. So we're just wrapping up our 3-round survey and community engagement and the draft vision and framework for the plan. That leads us into phase 3, which is drafting a complete version of the plan, which will go out again to public for consultation and final referral and adoption process. Just another look at the same thing, but in time. The survey closed at the mid-May, and we're now here. We've finished off our deep dive meetings with our community advisory group and are moving into policy development and eventually engagement on the policy towards the end of the summer. If you aren't aware, you can keep up to date on the project with our RDOS Regional Connections page. I post the most up-to-date action at the very top of the page, key links of things to go back and watch and look at right under that, and then all the other information you need is in the side panel. Just a few more shots of the side panel there, your key dates, phases of the project, and document folders full of lots of information. Basically everything we've done so far are all available to you. As well as you can ask questions through the forum there on Regional Connections if you are not able to ask something tonight. So with that, I will stop sharing and hand this over to Michael Bryden, who is our survey administrator for the 3-round survey that you all participated in. Michael, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I guess I can start my video here so you can see me. I'm just going to share up the presentation. And this should be familiar to some of you. Anyways, if you don't, my name is Michael Bryden. My colleague, Angelo Battiston, is also on the line. And what I'm here to do is talk a little bit about what we did in the 3-round survey, which ran since basically December of last year. So basically we have, let me just bring up the next slide here, a bit laggy. Basically the purpose of the surveys was to elicit some preferred objectives. And the bottom line summary, what the community told us is that the community wants to preserve natural beauty, the first point here, preserve natural beauty, which means forests, agricultural land, and so on. That turned out to be a priority. Increase the vibrancy of the village. And I'll talk about all these and the supporting evidence for them in a moment. Support commercial growth in the village, and I'll explain what we mean by that. And then finally, if there's going to be money spent, spend it on infrastructure, not necessarily amenities. So those are sort of the 4 big results of the survey, and you'll see that they actually entail quite a bit more. So just by way of background, tell you a little bit about the objectives of the consultation. I mean, our goal was to do something that is democratic, meaning involve a large number of people. You know, we always talk about we need to hear the voice of the community, and that means getting quite a few people to participate. We want to make a distinction between means and ends. That's very good decision-making practice, is not to confuse, you know, what you're trying to achieve ultimately, your ends or your objectives, with the ways of doing that. And you'll see how that played out in the surveys. And then also we wanted to force trade-offs. So people have ends, they have objectives, but because of economic or physical reality, these objectives often move in different directions. You can't have it all in essence. And then finally, we want to do a multi-round kind of long-term thing, survey, to enable deliberation, to enable people to discuss and maybe try to change each other's minds and so on. Okay, so I'll go through each one of these in turn. So in terms of democratic participation, our goal, our benchmark at the start of this process was to sort of approximate the number of people we have participating in the local elections, in the RDOS elections, because, you know, democracy isn't ruled by the people, it's ruled by the people who vote. And what we saw, we had 3 rounds of surveys, you know, going from the very simple brainstorming to the more elaborate round 3 evaluation. And in each case, the number of complete responses went up, and we finally achieved sort of our 500 mark for complete responses, you know, which is, you know, is part for sort of statistical reliability, but also for, you know, just to say that we did have good participation and that this survey wasn't ignored, and that the Naramata residents did take it seriously. In addition to that, we you know, more evidence that they took it seriously, or that you took it seriously, is, you know, so round 1, we had basically 3,000 comments, with people contributing a lot. In round 2, when you were asked to give feedback on the scenarios, 1,200 comments. You know, the median contribution for a participant was sort of a quarter page of text. And then we had comments in round 3, although they're not really being used. They're not being fed back into a round 4. So that is the democratic side of it. You know, we've discussed this before, the difference between means and ends, and a lot of people were curious about why we weren't talking about specific initiatives and projects during this process. But you know, as we said before, you know, something like sewer isn't an objective. It's a means to achieve an objective, like, say, you know, source water quality, or maybe densification. And even densification isn't an end in itself. It's a means of achieving something else, like, say, affordable housing, or vibrancy, this thing we called vibrancy in the village, or maybe even profitability. So within the community, all the people, you know, have different priorities, they have different preferences, they have different economic realities and economic interests. And what we're trying to do is determine a set of objectives or ends that really describes what people want in the community. So we did that, as you know, in round 1, by asking a much simpler question: what do you like and what do you not like about Area E? And then Danielle and I sort of went through a process of mapping these to, you know, what are people really saying they want in terms of objectives when they give us these likes and dislikes. And then, because of the interdependency between these objectives, we had to bundle these into scenarios. Okay, so an example of a scenario which results from a trade-off would be this example we've used before, is say a community, we call this the rural growth triangle, and we argue that most rural communities look at this, but people always want some kind of slow growth or rural ambiance, or, you know, in your case, keep Naramata the way it is. And of course, people want low taxes, and of course, people want amenities, infrastructure, services. But it turns out, for physical and economic reasons, that you can't have all three. You can't really have the intersection of these, but you can have combinations of two. So it's a classic trilemma. And so for example, scenario B, where you get the slow growth, you get the stuff, you get the infrastructure and services, but you give up low taxes. That corresponds to what we call self-funded rural. Okay, so the idea with self-funded rural is almost, you can think of it as a gated community strategy, or like a Newport, California strategy, if you like, where there's a lot of amenities, but taxes are high. So the residents choose to pay for those amenities in order to keep density and growth low. So, that is one of the scenarios that falls out of this kind of analysis of how these fundamental objectives interact and depend on each other. Okay, so what we ended up with, believe it or not, looking at all these fundamental objectives and sort of tracing through the interdependency, is only 5 really feasible scenarios, 5 viable scenarios, and you've seen each one of these, and they're all, think of these as baskets of goods and bads. Some objectives are realized and some are not. So for example, in Vibrant Village, you get the vibrant village, the community, but you don't, but at a cost of infrastructure. And then of course, everything that comes with probably densification, traffic, and so on and so forth. So you couldn't just say, I want it all. You had to sort of pick between these scenarios, which aren't necessarily realistic, but they are structured in a way that we can tease out priorities. So the final part of this was then the deliberation aspect. And this is new from when we talked last time about at the end of round 2. The deliberation part was in the round 3 survey, you got to reassess the scenarios, but in this case, you were given qualitative and quantitative feedback. What I mean by the qualitative feedback is, remember there are 1,200 comments submitted by people during round 2. And so Danielle went through those and found, fortunately, when you have 1,200 comments, people say the same thing by and large. I mean, not always, but you do get a little bit of overlap. So what Danielle did is went through all those comments and sort of mapped them to, a manageable set of sort of, I guess, characteristic comments, that the comments that most people could recognize, both pro and con. So you see things like, in terms of this self-funded rural scenarios, is you saw locals first, and people saying, I don't mind paying my fair share if we can keep development down and stuff like that. But then you get other people say, well, then you miss out on developers' comments. So these are in the words of the community saying, these are the advantages and disadvantages of each scenario. Now, the problem, of course, with these comments is you don't know whether this one, represents a widely held view, or this is just 1 or 2 people. So we supplemented that with this quantitative result, where you can see in round 2 how people actually voted. So for example, in this case, you see a lot of people strongly preferred one scenario over the other. And then we had the mean, and then when you were voting in round 3, you could sort of see which way the wind was blowing a little bit, and maybe reassess the comments in terms of that. Okay, so this you've seen more or less already when you did the survey, and if you've looked at the final results document, the draft, you've seen how this sort of played out in round 3. So I don't think there's much surprise if you're paying attention to round 2, but really 2 big results come from this. And the first is that there's little support for hillside development. This was the one scenario that envisioned, basically a free-for-all, notwithstanding the ALR, on the hillsides. And you can see the box is 50% of the data, and the scores go from negative at the bottom to positive at the top. And you can see that the horizontal line is the median. There's a little triangle there, which is the mean score. The point is most people didn't really like this. Now, it's not the case that all people didn't like this. Each one of these scenarios was someone's favorite. In fact, each one of these scenarios had a bit of a following, and you can see those people here. So if those were the people in your public meeting, or these were the people you were talking to at coffee, you would come away with the impression that hillside development was a great idea. And that's why we do a large panel multi-round survey, is to try to maybe get the whole story. And the whole story here is very little support for hillside development. We'll talk about the implications of that in a moment, because remember what we're talking about here is our goals, our objectives. We're not talking about necessarily a plan or specific projects or initiatives. We're just saying, given the choice, people would rather not have much going on the hillsides. At the same time, given the choice, it looks like the most popular scenario is this one where there's an increase in vibrancy in the village. Okay, whatever that means. Probably entails densification, probably entails commercial activity. But the idea is, people say, when we looked at these, we would like some changes. And this is actually a change, because the status quo is probably closer to this preserve and conserve scenario. Okay, so those are the final results, and like I said, they haven't changed much from round 2. We did see some deliberation. We did see some people change their opinions from round 2 to round 3, but in a lot of cases, it was more towards the winners and losers. That is, Vibrant Village went up, and support for Welcome the World went down. And some of the other ones, like Preserve and Conserve, stayed relatively stable. There wasn't a lot of change, maybe for predictable reasons. Now, a lot of people don't like doing pairwise comparisons. They take a long time, and I mean, they're easy, but they're a bit tedious. But the beauty of doing pairwise comparisons over the scenarios is it allows us then to isolate specific issues. So the dominant issue, of course, is this idea of village vibrancy. So one option was preserve and conserve, and the other was similar in that it said no hillside development. So preserve and conserve, recall, was basically no development anywhere to the extent that's possible. Whereas Vibrant Village was a bit of a compromise, saying, okay, don't develop on the hillsides, but given that Naramata does have a history of a township, exploit that to the extent that we can, and get some vibrancy in the village. And you can see the random photos. They're not random, but they're distorted, and they're not meant to be very specific, but they were meant to be evocative. And I think, the preserve and conserve, you get the sense of, the lakes, the agriculture, the forest, whereas the Vibrant Village, you get the sense of basically commercial activity. And in addition, you recall these scenarios do sort of outline some of the issues. So, there's few restrictions. There will be some increased infrastructure cost to take the village from where it is now to something that resembles this picture. So these scenarios were buckets of goods and bads. And what happened, of course, when we rated these, is there is, as always, a very strong, very adamant group who really prefers conservation. But a bit of a surprise here, there's almost an equally adamant group who would prefer a little change in the village, a little bit more vibrancy. And moreover, there's quite a few people who are kind of weakly in favor of this. So in a head-to-head comparison, we can see from the neutral point that the average is quite a bit to the right here in favor of Vibrant Village. So that is how we justify the conclusion that we would want to see the majority of people want to see the village move in a certain direction and not sort of stay the way it is. If we can call it, a lot of people might complain, say the village is plenty vibrant, but the point was to attract new stuff. Um, so that's an example of a pairwise comparison that was fairly unambiguous. Another small kind of, I wouldn't say small, but another sub issue that came up very early on is this idea of, okay, if we're going to consider allowing the village to grow, there's a couple different models. One is this idea where we focus on restrictions, okay, and the idea with restrictions is to maximize affordability and residential opportunities. And again, I think the picture, of course, that's not Naramata, but the picture gives a sense of, kind of a family first residential focus. Whereas Vibrant Village, to come back to this one, of course, it's few restrictions, very, very market based, whereas this would require, of course, some non-market based bylaws and restrictions. And the question is, well, in a head-to-head comparison, what do people like? What do people prefer? And here we saw, again, a fairly strong support towards, I guess, the market or the less restrictive version. And so we don't know why this is, because we never really got too low into why people were expressing these preferences. It could be that they want commercial activity. They want stores and restaurants and stuff like that. Or it could be they object to restrictions on property rights. But either way, we see some support. I mean, significant support for housing-focused village growth, but democratically, that one is stronger by quite a bit. The third one here is the paying for amenities. These two alternatives were basically similar. Preserve and conserve, which is basically try to do nothing. And self-funded rural, as we talked about previously, is if we want amenities, if we want services and so on, we'll just pay for them ourselves, but keep the preserve and conserve idea going, but let taxes slip. And what we saw in Vibrant Village was a willingness to accept taxes to the extent they paid for infrastructure. But here, what we see instead is, very strong support, as always, for preserve and conserve. And it's just missing here for kind of the gated community strategy of, let's build our own stuff. Let's build a community with a lot of services and amenities, publicly funded services and amenities. There's quite a few people here, but their preferences aren't as strong. So as a result, this mean gets pulled to the left. So this, of all the conclusions, is sort of the weakest in the sense that I think people might be favorable to specific proposals that involved increased taxes for specific amenities. But there is a lot of people who basically would prefer the lowest cost existence, which is surprising in Naramata because statistically, of course, Naramata is a fairly affluent community. And, so there are people there who might be willing to pay more. But even so, we're not seeing support for that. We did see in round one, a lot of people say, we really, when we said, what do you like and what do you not like about Naramata, we had all sorts of people say, we need this, we need this, we need this. But when push comes to shove, apparently they're only weakly in favor of paying for it, which is entirely natural. Okay, so what do we take away from this exercise? Well, first is we did have very good participation, both in terms of numbers and in terms of effort from the community. Basically 5,000 comments were submitted over this process, which is a lot. As in many communities, we saw significant polarization, where in almost every pairwise comparison, we had a big bar on the left and a big bar on the right. And So I mean, I think it's important that people recognize generally that there is not a consensus in this community for how it should emerge. And like I mentioned earlier, every single scenario had its proponents. And of course, every single scenario also had people who just rated it last. So we do have significant polarization, but in a sense, we do also have this idea of a majority support. In some cases, a fairly clear majority support for some scenarios. And it's important that we have that for an official community plan, because as I sort of get on to the next idea here, is the next step is then we pass this over to RDO staff and to the elected officials, and it's really up to them now to do what they do, which is design policies and initiatives that satisfy these priorities that emerged during this consultation process. So as you may or may not know, regional districts in British Columbia are relatively weak when it comes to actually doing stuff, to implementing plans. All they can do is create an environment and signal, of course, through the official community plan that a community has the intention or the desire to go one way or the other. So that's where the clear majority support becomes important, because the kind of things we're asking the RDOS to do now takes discipline. So for example, when you say minimize to the extent possible hillside development, well, in a lot of ways that's not realistic because there's existing property rights, and in most cases that I hate to say it, but the horse has left the barn already. But in the future, when faced with proposals or variances or rezonings or whatever that says, just one more house, just one more little house on the hill, just one more little subdivision, the OCP might kind of give the impression that that's not okay, because one house, as we all know, one house, one exception over 20 years leads to a complete undermining of the preferences of the majority. So this requires discipline. Of course, the other side of the coin is if you want a vibrant village, then and you signal that in your official community plan, then that's kind of a contract in the sense that the RDOS can't do anything. The RDOS isn't going to build stores or open restaurants or do anything else. In the regional districts, you require developers to basically move anything forward in terms of growth. And if the majority says we want to move in this direction as a means to achieve other things, but then you have it's blocked by a small minority, well, then that's the opposite problem, because you've given through your official community plan the people who actually do stuff, the people in the private sector who gamble, you've given them a signal, and then if it gets blocked by a small minority, then that becomes a problem. So just a heads up on the implications of how these things play out. Really, what our job now is to support the engineers, the planners, the accountants, and so on, as they move forward to say, okay, what specifically can we do to achieve these compromises? Because most of the highly supported scenarios are compromises, and I think that is one of the good takeaways from this, is the community recognize the need to sort of accommodate each other, and sort of strike a balance, and that's, at least from the outside looking in, that is good news. So that's it for what I have. I could take some questions if people have questions. I have some additional slides if people have specific questions, but that's it sort of for the rundown of the results of the survey.
Thank you, Michael. So for those of you who have joined a little bit late, Michael is presenting the results of our community survey that you all did in 3 rounds. And I will be getting into what we're doing with that next, being our community vision and our draft broad goals. So before I do that, if you have any clarification questions only about what Michael just presented, please raise your hand if you're on your computer, or press *3 if you're on your phone. And again, try to keep it to clarification questions. We'll take general questions towards the end.
I think I bored them.
Okay, last call to either raise your hand or press. Sorry? Aboard them. Yeah, I was involved. I was listening. Okay, seeing none, I'm going to move on to the next part of the presentation, and then we will come back around to questions if you think of any that you would like to add. So Michael's done a great job of presenting what we heard and how we heard it from you. And my job is to show you what we're going to do with that through our official community plan review. I'll just start sharing slides with you again. I always like to see where we've been before we talk about where we're going. So in our previous official community plan, which was completed in 2006, but the planning started in 2004. So we're coming up on almost 20 years here. The vision was, we envision a caring and relaxed rural community that is sustained through creativity, diversity, and collaboration. This is basically the vision statement there. So quite simple. The new proposed one, which is not final by any means and open for discussion today and in following meetings, is opening with a bit of a just general statement here. Electoral Area E is a rural area made up of the Naramata village, surrounding farmland and smaller residential neighborhoods. Residents value the quiet rural character, sense of community, and proximity to nature. And that comes from what we heard from you in the first round of the survey with likes and dislikes. And then from our survey results leading to the vision here, the community envisions a more vibrant village with a diversity of families that supports year-round businesses and respects the history and quaint character of the area. The natural areas and farmland are preserved through stewardship and public education. So again, this is coming from that idea that more or less 2/3 of the people who participated in the survey were in favor of a vibrant village, and we still have about 1/3 of the community that's more on the other side of status quo and preserve and conserve. So that's where that idea of respecting the history and the quaint character of the area comes in to grow in a way that's managed and still feels like a village rather than a city. I will come back to this slide so that you can see the wording again. But the second piece of this is the broad goals. So in the previous OCP back in 2006, the goals were quite simple and still very similar to what we heard from you in this round of the surveys. So speaking to preserving the community heritage and character, which is more that idea of preserving, conserve, likewise in the village. Managing the growth and development, which is the one that's probably a bit different now. Still, of course, managing it within means, but encouraging a bit more growth within the village area. Stewardship of natural resources through conservation and public education is still very much a want and vision of the community, likewise with agriculture and the rural character. And then finally, a little bit of development here with the 6th and 7th goals towards some community services and facilities and some affordable housing and seniors housing. So I've translated this in combination with what we heard from you through all of the surveys to be a little bit more detailed. And again, I'm just going over this quite quickly and I will show it again. But the opening sentences here just for consistency with our other official community plans that have been updated recently. But I've distilled everything we heard from you and all 5,000 plus comments that I've read, every single one, to about 9 points here. So the first being community spirit, this idea that you really value the friendliness, the warmth, small town feel, and then supporting community events like your farmers market, like the Chittislow, like other designations like your Bear Aware community. The second being speaking to environment, both on the natural beauty side as well as the ecosystem and protection of our environmental assets, which I've heard in many ways is very important to the community, certainly on the hillsides as well as the creeks and the waterfront, the lakes, etc. Third being rural character, which is similar to the first, but different, speaking more to the development forms, peaceful, and the heritage of the area. Good. We come into a couple more here that do speak to some more development than in the past. So affordability does, to get affordable housing options, there need to be opportunities for that. So likely would be more development in the village, bringing in more affordable forms of housing, like smaller lots of smaller houses, or townhouses, things that are more approachable for young families. Smaller businesses that are more approachable for a startup, as well as a variety of employment opportunities for a live-work type of community within the village. Oops, hitting buttons here. Agriculture, very much the same, maintaining what we have through the agricultural land reserve, making sure we encourage compatible farm uses on that land and discouraging subdivision and overdevelopment on that land. Infrastructure is a bit of a mixed one, excuse me. We heard from you that it's important to maintain what we have and make sure that it can have enough capacity for growth, whatever that growth might look like within the village area primarily, but also some of the infill that's remaining. And then also some new infrastructure opportunities, but keeping those within things that support the rural charm. So, for example, a community sewer might be supported under that because it protects from leaching into the water table with not nice stuff, but adding a whole bunch of streetlights would not be consistent with the rural charm. Economic development, again, is tied to this idea of the vibrant village, encouraging more small businesses. Definitely a lot of things came out about being supportable year round, and that goes hand in hand with affordable housing. You have more businesses where people can work at and live and work in the community, that in hand with more affordable housing where people can move into your community and work more service type of jobs, then those two can help add to what's in the village. And finally, speaking to community health and safety, which didn't come up a lot, but certainly is there for mitigating wildfire, flood, other natural disasters, a little bit of aging in place and other types of well-being, like making sure water and sewerage are all good and in place. And then lastly, collaborating with the Penticton Indian Band, improving communication, engagement, etc. So again, I'll flash it back on screen if questions come up. I'm going to leave it here and open up to first our community advisory group, but then also everyone who's here from the community with feedback on what you've seen, what you've heard, trying to stay more towards the content rather than wordsmithing. Of course, meanings of words are important, so we can get into that, but I'd rather talk about the bulky content. So thinking about that, how do the new draft vision and goals sit with you? Is there anything missing? And is there anything that should be removed? I am going to stop sharing. And once again, if you have thoughts, questions, etc., now is the time to use the raise hand button. So bottom right hand side of your screen to click participants and then raise your hand. And if you're on your phone, you can use *3 to raise your hand. Skull, please go ahead.
Danielle,
Okay, I unmuted you. If you were speaking, I
I
can't hear you.
unmuted myself. Can you hear me? Danielle?
We can hear you now.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's there's a lot of sweat and blood gone into
Yes, we
this.
can hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me? Danielle, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I said there's been a lot of sweat and blood gone into this. Thank you very much. Can
I
I
can hear you, but
can I
maybe you can't hear me.
Sorry, I don't know if I should carry on talking or not. Danielle, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. I said there's been a lot of sweat and blood gone into this, and I thank you for that. The goals, it should be broad on the one hand. On the other hand, it seems to be too broad. You know, like your number 3, if I remember correctly, mentions nothing about no desire for hillside development. It just says, yeah, well, we like the village to grow and so on. I would have thought that the goal should be very explicit in saying that the growth will be directed to a very specific area. And that is where it should almost stop or be bounded by. And then, you know, in number 6, you were talking about services, and you were talking about existing services. And the whole problem of developing the village are twofold, and I'll stick to one for the moment, which is having a sewer system that will enable medium density housing, that will create affordable housing, etc. So there's nothing in there that actually says that we need that as a precursor or a definite requirement before any development there can actually be done. Now, we've had this discussion before, and it says, well, you can have all these fancy systems and so on, and all those fancy systems cost money, which makes it unaffordable again. So I would have thought the goals there need to be wordsmithed, and you said you don't want to do that, but it's too broad. You're not getting to the actual requirements that you would need. And then there's something I feel very strongly about, which is a proviso that this 1.5% per annum, if you curve that out, I'm adamant that the growth should be capped by a safe capacity for the Naramata Road. We're not mentioning that anywhere. We're just saying we're going to carry happily along and we will develop this. And by the way, without a realistic surveys, and realistic, I mean, you don't do the survey the first weekend after the September weekend. You do it at the height of construction. And done by a professional doing a scientific analysis of this, knowing what the capacity of the Naramata Road is for safety and so on. And secondly, another big miss at the moment is a protocol that should there be a road closure because a low bed actually collapsed next to the road and closed it off. I had the unfortunate incident that I have to take somebody with a heart condition to the hospital. Should there have been an issue on the road, it would have been ugly. And you know, we have no protocol at the moment that says if there is a road closure, there should be ambulance or transport or something on standby. You cannot simply close off the road for an hour or two in case of emergency. So that's sort of the comments I had at the moment in broad goals. The goals on the one hand, yes, that's where we want to go. On the other hand, we shouldn't be blind to the obstructions that would prevent us from achieving those goals.
Thank you, Scott. Yes, definitely. Not all of this is not all of that is wordsmithing, a lot of that is content, which is exactly what I'm looking for, which is great. Definitely in the broad goals, saying something explicit about the Hillside development is absolutely fair, as well as being a bit more explicit about sewer. I only hesitate there because there are options for some growth with sewerage systems that are private. It's just the scope may be different than a public community sewer, but regardless, is something to explore further. The Naramata Road is something, it may go in the broad goals, but it probably goes more specifically into the transportation section, as well as the growth management section for how and where things go. So these are high level at the very beginning, first section of the OCP, and then everything in the OCP fleshes out and supports what's in these broad goals. But certainly one of the things we've talked about before that needs to happen is some sort of road study, because we don't have a good accurate one now. So the OCP can't give a number that we don't have. And just for your sanity's sake, if Naramata Road was closed and there was some sort of an emergency vehicles can drive on the KBR if they need access outside of Naramata Road. And, okay, I saw another hand. And Sculpt, we will come back to this in all of our follow-up meetings after this. Sue Kirschman, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. I can't tell.
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. I think I unmuted myself for a second. First of all, thank you so much, Danielle and Michael, for your great summaries, and for the committee for all the work that everyone's put into this process so far. I have quite a lot of concern about the climate, about climate change, and I know a number of people, a lot of people in the village do as well. And I haven't really seen much in the way of climate change addressed in this process, other than one of the presentations by Jeremy. And in order to deal with our emissions, lower our emissions, as we all know we need to, everything that we do in an official community plan affects emissions, right from development to agriculture to preserving nature, natural areas. And I think, I'm just thinking that that should be a broad goal, or somehow an overriding goal that is implemented through all of the different areas that you've outlined. I'm hoping to see a whole lot of really strong policies on climate, but I'm just thinking in terms of these broad goals, if it can somehow be incorporated, because it's important. So that's my comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. Definitely, I was thinking of that piece more in the environmental one, which I can't remember what number it is right now, but it's something that is very fair, probably very important to call out explicitly, as well as there's an entire section in the OCP that will be dedicated to greenhouse gas emissions and much more rigorous goals than was in the previous OCP about 20 years ago. Okay. Anyone else? So whether you're on the community advisory group or for the general community joining us tonight, you are all welcome to participate. So bottom right-hand corner, participants, and then hover by your name is the option to raise hands. And if you're on the phone, use *3. David Towser, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now? Let's see. Yes, okay. I'm just wondering, in the OCP process, at what point will we have focus groups? For instance, as Sue said about the climate or the greenhouse gas. I think there needs to be a group of people who are interested in that with a review of the issue of the chapter that's there, which is very short, looking at what we're able to do or add to our community plan at this point that ensures that we are proceeding in a way that we're protecting the climate. And not just in terms of climate, but focus groups on other issues, such as the growth area or vacation rentals. It seems to me there has not been enough specific or dedicated time where we're able to speak our thoughts about these issues, other than meetings such as this, where it's broad and we're getting a lot of information. So I'm just really wondering, at what stage is the OCP in? It seems to me it should be prior to policy development, but maybe part of it, that we will be spending time in focus groups. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So it's we've done a piece of that through the 5 deep dives that we did, which was very much getting the information out, more of an educational piece. And then tied to that was the worksheets that I sent out, which the goal of that was to start to get your feedback and see. I split up all of the sections of the OCP that are current into each of the topics with a bit of a worksheet saying, you know, this makes sense, this is out of date, this is what we might want to change, I think we need to include whatever it may be. And to date, not a single person on the committee has done that. So it's something I'm bringing back at our next committee meeting on the 14th. So we're kind of switching phases now from education and gathering general community input to more specifics on each of the topics and getting into what changes to the policy should be. So that is policy development. And what the community advisory group meetings are going to look like moving forward are more of this type of thing where I present to you a small piece of draft. So just, you know, this is 1 page of the OCP, a very important page, but 1 page. And then the majority of the meeting will be you guys offering feedback to me and or working in small groups to generate some feedback on that draft change so that we can get to an ultimate document.
Okay, but just personally, what I feel is that receiving a policy coming from the RDOS or from you about the issues, I haven't really felt it was the right time to start spending more time thinking about the details of a specific chapter or a specific area. It seems there's a lot of information in the deep dive sessions that we've received, and not enough time to really process that and spend time processing it and coming up with our thoughts about it. And I would like to, well, I would think that there are different subgroups within the larger group that are interested in different areas. So I think we should, at the minimum, be approaching each chapter or each section of the OCP in that way, where we look at the original chapter and what is proposed, and spend time deciding what changes should be made and what the language should be. So I would like to see more of a smaller group, focus groups, as we go forward in the policy development part. Thank you.
Definitely. This is exactly where we're going. That
Okay.
All of our meetings over the summer, probably going into October, is section by section. And the format, I'm open for discussion, whether it's, all 20 whatever sitting together, or tables, or different topics at different tables.
Okay, fine. Thank you. We'll see. We'll talk about it more. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. I think I have a delay if I am delaying to any of you. That's what's happening here on this system. But I do not see any other hands. Okay. Sue, is that a new hand?
It is, yeah. I just had one quick question further to what David just said. I'm not on the committee, but are you open, or are there opportunities for non-committee members to provide input? For example, I'd love to be in one of these focus groups, but or to have some means of just being able to provide some input. I'm just wondering if your process has room for that.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Yes. So this is a community plan. That's why we have touch points like this. And certainly the community advisory group is the set group of volunteers from the community that will be on the very, very detailed meetings, but we will come back out to open public meetings like this with other topics.
I guess that's not quite what I meant. I was meaning to provide input to and discussion before you come to the decisions.
That is before the decisions. We have to come with pieces of draft information rather than just an open topic.
Okay. Thanks. I'm probably misunderstanding the process. Thank you.
Okay, I can try again to clarify for you. So each piece of information can be very detailed. Official community plans are generally 150 or so pages. So there's a group of volunteers from the community that have come together to be on those more detailed discussions, and if they want to open it up to more community members for something specific, that's an option. But nothing is final until it goes forward to the board. So even if we come out with something that may be in a draft form with some ideas like today, that doesn't mean that that's what's going to move forward ultimately to the board. This is a community plan that needs to reflect the community as a whole. So at each point, there's points for input, and certainly it adjusts and changes to those pieces of input because it needs to reflect what you guys as the community are saying. I'm not seeing any other hands, but if you have other feedback, go ahead and raise your hands or press the *3. I'm just going to present quickly our prize winners for the survey because I did say that we would do prizes for 3 of the community members who completed the survey. So prize winners, I don't think I saw any of them on the line, but let's see. So the first is Dave Anderson, and just so you all know, they were selected completely randomly. Michael put the list with all numbers beside them, and I used a random number generator to pick the numbers associated with the name. So these have all been selected by chance from those people who completed the survey. Our second is Melissa Campbell, also winning a gift certificate to the Naramata store. And then finally, Amanda Hancock winning the gift certificate to the Naramata Inn. So those will all be sent out to them. Finally, I'll just check if there's any further hands before I close the meeting, but if you didn't get a chance to speak tonight or you're still thinking things over and come up with questions and comments later, you can always send it to me by email. I'm at ddevries@rdos.bc.ca for those of you on the phone. Otherwise, it's on screen. You can also submit questions to the RDO's Regional Connections page. And this is recorded and will be posted on YouTube if you want to go back and listen to something again, as well as I will post the slides on the RDO's Regional Connections page. So you can take a look at the draft vision and goals there again, and think about those questions. How do they sit with you? Is there anything missing? And is there anything that should be added? With that, I will stop sharing. I don't see any more hands, so thank you to all of you for coming out tonight and participating and listening. It's great to see so many of you here on our thunderstormy night. And you may go and enjoy your evening with your families. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.